Chapter 5 Dark Sphere. As the sun began to descend towards the horizon, Idris had taken up a spot at the prow of the boat, watching the mangroves whilst at the same time guiding them through the labyrinthian river network. The mangroves had swarmed with flies and moths in the evening light, before birds and then bats began to swoop through the air as the night's hunt began. The three lion brothers kept the boat going in the right direction and at pace, when suddenly large sandy islands began to appear in front of them, dividing the flow of water. Each of the small islands' banks were lined with crocodiles, each one patiently waiting for the warmth of the returning sun or a potential meal. Blitzen looked at the fading sunlight and the rising moon. "We should be out of the mangroves by now. Are we lost?" he asked the brothers. "No, of course we're not," Oscar replied. "Well, maybe a little," the largest of the brothers admitted. "I thought it was supposed to be quicker coming this way," Kyle asked. The brothers turned and looked at him. "We'll get there before night, don't you worry," Ozzy told him, before they all turned and began paddling faster. They followed the river for a little while longer, passing the low sandy islands and avoiding the hungry crocodiles. After passing a large clump of knotted mangrove roots, the channel widened and a large piece of land appeared in front of them. Idris instantly took off, flying out over the mangroves and climbing high above the land, hoping to get a clearer view. Once he had identified where they were, he flew back to the boat, dropping out of the darkness and landing on the edge of the boat suddenly. Laughing to himself as the others calmed themselves again, Katie wasn't the only one that had screamed, but her heart was still racing moments later. The sun had just set as Peter jumped ashore and tied the boat off. "We go on foot from here, children," Blitzen told them, whilst he helped the others to pull the boat ashore. "Where exactly are we going?" Katie asked. "There's an old ruined temple on a chain of islands that extends southwest from the coast. I can only guess this is where the king has gone, so this is where we are going," Blitzen replied. "The old temple was built in the elder days by the first humans to travel our world," Barry informed them. "It is said that the first travellers transformed us from animals into what we are now. That the first lion, Alarion, who our king is named after, was the first to see the wisdom of the humans," Peter explained as he morphed between his rabbit and human state. The three lion brothers roared across the open plains, waiting for a response, but only the waves crashing the shoreline and the whipping winds greeted them in the darkness. "We should find somewhere to rest," Peter said, whilst the group climbed the incline to the top of the cliffs. "It is late, maybe you're right," Oscar replied, climbing the last section of the cliff top first. The winds were strong that night. They found what shelter they could, but the wild wastes were not the most hospitable of landscapes. Their group settled down in a dell formed under a tree and lit a small fire before they all huddled close for warmth. Katie and Kyle were the first to fall asleep, followed shortly after by the adults and the lion brothers. Even Max slept well. The night passed quickly, and soon they were all awake and yawning once again. "What's going on?" Katie asked in a panic. "I can't see anything," she said, panicking blindly. The others quickly leapt to their feet, rubbing their eyes in the strange gloom surrounding them, whilst Max started barking loudly. Suddenly the dense darkness lifted from their small campsite, spinning like a thick cloud of dark smoke. Light flooded back into their eyes, and the monster retreated quickly, disappearing from their blinking eyes as it ascended into the sky above them. "What was that thing?" Katie asked, calming herself. "I've never seen anything like them before the other night," Blitzen admitted, "but I've heard the old tales, and they mentioned creatures named phantoms," Blitzen told them, still shocked by what they had witnessed. It was different from the previous one, though, he thought out loud. It was larger, more confident, and much more threatening, Blitzen said. "We shouldn't dwell on it for long, though," Peter told him. "We must find the king today," he continued. Soon they were walking again, and at pace. As they crossed a ridge in the land, they saw a group of islands off the coast. and the ruins of an old temple in the distance. The walls of the once mighty structure had crumbled in places. It would have been magnificent in its day, but now it lay in ruins, and it was covered in moss and vines. Suddenly they noticed a dark orb hanging in the air directly above the central chamber of the old temple. The orb glistened and shone, but it only half reflected the brilliant daylight. They were standing miles away from the old temple and the orb, but an ominous power radiated from it, chilling them slightly. The three brothers morphed into lion form and roared in unison, adding to one another's calls before they waited for a response once again. For a while, nothing happened, but then, suddenly, the king replied from a distance. A mighty roar rang out from within the temple, amplified by its walls before it echoed out across the landscape. The three brothers looked at one another, pleased for a split second, before turning back towards the temple in shock. The sky suddenly flashed, lighting up so bright that they could hardly see their own hands in front of their eyes. Then dark clouds began to swirl in the sky, and lightning flashed, and then again, striking the orb as it began to glow and pulsate. The sky dimmed once again and grew completely dark, yet the orb was still glowing a pale, pearlescent colour. The pulsations were slow at first, but then they increased in intensity, and the orb began to grow, stretching out in all directions. The 60-foot tower at the centre of the temple began to disappear within the growing, dark void. "Quickly!" Blitzen shouted, before they all began to charge down the cliffs and towards the bridges that spanned the islands leading towards the old temple. No matter how quickly they ran, though, they were never going to make it in time. The dark void had expanded to the point where it had almost engulfed the entire temple. The three lions didn't hold back, though, charging off alone, but even with their added pace, they couldn't reach the ruins before they had completely disappeared behind the dark veil. The darkness stopped growing, and then the shifting orb began to levitate a few feet up. Once it had lifted from the landscape, the temple was completely gone, and so was half of the coastline, leaving a large hole in the island where it had once been. "Well, what now?" Kyle asked, as he slumped down where he had been standing. "I knew you guys should have paddled faster," he said to the brothers. "Shush, child, our father is trapped in there," Oscar said, distracted, touching the black orb with an extended claw. The surface of the orb rippled, but it wouldn't allow his claw to pass through. "We're stuck," Peter said. "We can't be too late," Blitzen said, angry with himself. "Don't stress now, Blitzen, we must think," Barry told him. "And you're the clever one," he continued, looking at the large dark orb that floated a few feet above ground level. Whilst the group sat looking at the giant dark orb, its smoky glassy texture swirling in the wind, something strange began to happen. The orb began to pulse and then vibrate again, faster and faster, until it began to lift higher into the air. This time the ruins of the old temple had been left behind, but it left a scar in the land where it had been dropped back into the landscape. More of the large blocks fell from the shaking tower, embedding themselves in the soft mud around the ruins. Blitzen and Barry had to think fast, dodging a large falling block that would otherwise crush them. Once things had settled down again, the group ran inside the temple, but there was no sign of the king anywhere. The three brothers roared angrily up at the dark sphere hanging in the air high above them now. Almost instantly it began to shrink, until the point where it couldn't have been much larger than the king himself. Katie was looking at the carvings on the walls. "Kyle, quickly, come and have a look at these," she shouted. "Children, no one can read those old symbols," Blitzen shouted as Carl ran towards his sister. "You're not safe here. Stay close to me," Blitzen told them. Kyle didn't wait, though. He ran to look at what his sister was interested in. "They might not know what they mean, but I'm pretty sure you and I can tell what most of this means. Look," she said, pointing to a large image with a series of glyphs underneath it. The image depicted a large lion facing off against an evil spirit. The spirit would then surround and fight for control of the king's mind and body. Katie was already looking at the glyphs underneath. "Look," she said again. "This says that two people have to play some kind of instrument to create the right sound, the right frequency or vibration," she told him. "Otherwise the dark energy will take control of the king and darkness will rule," Katie told her brother. She turned to the others. "Quickly," she shouted. "There has to be some kind of musical instrument around," she told them. "Two of us need to play them at the same time," she shouted as the others began to look around the ruined temple. "Where are we supposed to look?" one of the three brothers asked. "This place is centuries old and ruined. They can't still be here," another of the brothers responded. "Keep looking," Katie urged as she studied the other pictures and glyphs. "They have to be here," she continued. Suddenly Carl shouted, "Katie, quickly look at this!" He shouted over to her. One of the walls had a carving on it, and in the outstretched arms lay a flute made of blue and white marble. "This has to be it," Carl said, lifting it into his hands. The dark orb began to vibrate violently above them, pulsing larger before shrinking again. "We have to be quick," Katie said. "Where is the other one?" she asked as the rest of the group searched the walls of the ruins frantically. "I found it," Oliver shouted, taking a harp made of the same marble out of an alcove in the wall. He smiled at the others as they approached. "Now we just have to play them, right?" he said, taking the harp into a playing position. At that moment, the larger cloud of dark smoke flew into the temple at pace, constricting itself into a dense dark ball. Flying through the ruins, it crashed into Oliver, sending him sprawling across the floor, dropping the marble harp in the process. "Brother!" the other two lions shouted together, running to join him in the corner of the room. The dark cloud of smoke shifted like the dark orb high above, growing in size, becoming wispier like smoke, before shrinking to a dense black ball again. Without the harp in hand, the darkness lingered just above the walls, watching and waiting.